I'm delighted to introduce Jessikka Aro today, who is a Finnish journalist and also the author of the non-fiction book, Putin's Trolls. In September 2014, she began to investigate pro-Russian internet trolls, but became a victim of their activities herself, which forced her to flee her native country of Finland. She was due to receive the 2019 International Women of Courage Award in the US, but this was rescinded shortly before the award ceremony, apparently because of criticism she made of President Trump on social media. Jessika, it's an absolutely huge pleasure to speak to you, and I was so pleased to see your book come out in English because I was aware of it a few years ago. Unfortunately, my Finnish is non-existent, so I had to wait a few years in order to read it.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's such a pleasure, and thank you so much for your supportive messages. It's been so priceless reading them, how enthusiastically you have been waiting for the book. I'm so happy that we can now finally speak about it.
Fantastic. Now, this is absolutely brilliant opportunity. So let's start with the impact of your campaign, your research, and writing the book. You endured a 2.5-year campaign of death threats, libelous accusations before having to flee Finland. How is such a thing even possible?
It is unfortunately possible when you have Russian trolls and Russian security services influence operations in the West, it seems. Unfortunately, I had to find that out myself. It was really when I go back to that time, this was in 2016, 2017, I remember I was living in constant fear, in constant having to look over my shoulder, having to read, even on my free time, around the clock, this filth just pouring in from every channel. And the police was also giving me instructions that I should start to look after my surroundings. I should start look after if there's any suspicious activities around my own apartment, if there is some suspicious things under my car, so I was forced to live this crazy life, which didn't feel normal at all. But then I noticed that whenever I'm abroad, I get to be in peace. And so I decided to move away so that I was able to write this book and to live a somewhat normal life. But yeah, this was all due to my investigations, which I had started a couple of years earlier. But it was really horrible. And the worst thing really was to see my own friends turn into enemies.
That's really weird. And of course, your only crime was to investigate Russia's social media information warfare. Do you think, this process that kicked in, is this kind of a defensive mechanism to protect their asset? Or is it some kind of personal vendetta by a powerful individual?
There are many different missions that these propaganda architects have and reasons why they do such disgusting operations against Westerners, but of course also Russians. So in my case, was to stop me from writing these articles and to create this feeling of fear, which indeed I'm feeling, and then act on that fear and stop reporting about Russia issues. And also then to marginalize me in public sphere so that no one would believe when I would give interviews and give lectures about Russian trolls. And it did succeed to a certain degree because so many people still think that Jessikka Aro is this lunatic pro-NATO troll herself, who is only just making stuff up, and Russian trolls don't really exist. Seriously, there are now certain amount of people who still believe that Russian trolls only exist in my imagination. So this is the basic concept of Russian information operations and attacks against individuals. They try to destroy the credibility and basically make you some kind of pariah.
And the most shocking thing, I think, and I'm sure it was for you, that there seemed to be very little recourse to the rule of law or even police protection. I know you received, some advice from the police, but it seems like there was a real limit on what could be done. Is that down to apathy or difference? Or do the laws just not exist to protect individuals from this kind of malicious activity?
Yeah, so we went to speak with some security officials, and they did indeed consult us. And with us, I mean me and my employer, the Finnish broadcasting company. And they, for example, advised us that I should not travel to Russia because it's not a good idea anymore, because I was already under the Russians' radar. So we have, and I have personally received encouragement and very good advice, and also some security advice. But then, as you said, there is no legal framework to protect individual citizens. I am not, for example, any part of any state structures. For example, I'm not a police or I'm not a security officer who would have some kind of protection employer, like official protection. Instead, I'm a journalist, and for journalists, there just isn't processes, there aren't systems in place. And unfortunately, these attackers and Russian security services, they know that. And they know how to exploit that, and they know how our Western countries are free countries and based and built upon trust and good manners and respect and other good values, and they attack that ruthlessly.
What do you think is the role of the social media technology companies? It's clear that when you were targeted, they did very little about that. Has that changed though? Are they still a willing participant, and do they provide a platform for state-sponsored hate speech and propaganda? Obviously, platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and so on.
Facing it, as I started to monitor the Russian trolls and social media propagandist activities, mostly first on Facebook, on Twitter, as well as on YouTube, I realized that there are so many different ways how these trolls are exploiting these channels, and how these channels definitely aren't and weren't at that time doing basically anything to stop them. Let me give you just some examples. These trolls were building groups on Facebook in which the only aim was to spread Russian state propaganda, as well as attack individuals who were investigating Russia, who were just doing their job, so journalists and researchers and such. And seriously, there was a network of such groups on Facebook, not just in Finnish language, but also in other languages, for example, in Swedish, as well as many others. And when me and my friends started to report these groups because they incited hatred, they were spreading hate speech, they were committing crimes. When we reported those groups to Facebook, Facebook just told that they were not breaking any community standards. So basically did nothing. And even later on, as I realized, as many others also started to realize, that these trolls are seriously being used also to attack, for example, the US presidential elections 2016. And I realized that they are not just a threat to freedom of speech, but also a threat to national security of different countries. Then I also try to warn Facebook and other social media companies not to enable these trolls and Russian security structures and propagandists. But unfortunately, these companies are really good at giving nice speeches in different conferences, claiming that they protect vulnerable communities and such. But when in fact they do nothing or nearly not enough. And now we have seen with the Putin's accelerated warfare against Ukraine, which started now in February this year, only then we saw YouTube as well as Facebook demonetizing some of these Russian state media channels from their own platforms. And there we can see why they have let them operate so long, because they provide profit to these companies.
How do you think Western laws need to change in order to keep up with the evolution of social media technology? And of course, what we see in Russia, the weaponization of these platforms by malicious state actors, and of course, their proxies and surrogates. As you found out in Finland, there are plenty of those too.
Another excellent question. Thank you. First thing is to see that the social media companies are themselves heavily lobbying in order to provide themselves the maximum freedoms and maximum rights. So we need to be really aware that these companies are trying to bend our own legislation and to take it to the direction that is beneficial only to these companies and not to our citizens. So what I have kindly recommended, and I still do, would be to make these companies obey their own community standards, which are often in line with local legislations. For example, that they would not allow very basic forms of criminal activity. For example, libels or stalking, as well as spreading hate speech. So to start from there, and the European Commission has even tried to have those companies take down hate speech, but still it exists. So then another thing would be to maybe make some kind of a law so that these companies would be they would be forced to provide information about Russian state-sponsored propaganda operations coming from troll factories, as well as from, well, just any foreign malicious, like FSB style operations. And then it would be worthwhile for Western governments to also build alliances in order to counterattack and recognize those operations. So if that was legally binding to these companies to provide this information, it would be so much more easier for Western governments and their citizens to protect themselves. At the moment, it's basically impossible. Think about how dystopian it really is that we often learn about these specific operations targeted at specific countries, specific political events, only maybe a couple of years after they have already taken their toll and effect. For example, Russian trolls attack against US presidential elections 2016, when trolls wanted to raise Donald Trump as the president. So those operations got to operate freely for so long and to reach so many people, so many real Americans, before they were unearthed and before any people got even warned that such operations exist. So basically what I would want to see would be some legal framework to make Russian troll operations on social media platform.
So if we think a bit more strategically, what do you think the primary objective of this Russian disinformation strategy is? Is it to kind of debase and devalue civic discussion, or is it to foster conflict, apathy, and indifference? And of course, to an extent, we saw that in the US, we saw that in stoking racial divisions, class and party divisions. And of course, we've seen that in Britain as well with Brexit. Extraordinary, conflict between generations and people with different points of view.
Basically all of them and many more. But if I would have to just name one objective, it would be to damage the West as heavily as possible, as kind of like an option to real full-fledged kinetic warfare. So this is attempt to destroy us, basically. And I found from actually a great British book written by Peter Wright, who is, maybe you know him, maybe familiar name to many.
Master, I remember.
Yes,
so, yes.
Yes. So the spy catcher, and who worked with the British intelligence in the technology, senior spy basically during the Cold War, and he documented in his book that the Russian/Soviet defectors told that back in 1958, the then KGB chief Shelepin actually was tasked with modernizing the KGB, and his job then included finding ideas on how to most hurt the West without waging a full war. And he invited the best agents to Russia and to brainstorm, and they came up with the idea of these fake information campaigns. So what we're seeing and witnessing at the moment, I would say, are rooting and coming from this same idea to hurt us. And unfortunately, they do it really well. And like, for example, Bill Browder says in my book, this originally US financier who has become probably the heaviest Western target for the Kremlin and for Putin himself. So Bill Browder has said that it doesn't matter the Russians if they fail most of the times, because there is no parliamentary oversight of spending of this money on these fake information campaigns. So it doesn't matter if they fail most of them, if they only succeed in some of them. But to name some other objectives would be obviously to influence people's behavior, and doing that through their cognitive, um, uh, basically through their ideas and thinking, so information. So also to break down political unions, for example, European Union, Britain's membership in the union as well. The trolls were promoting it, and mostly they want to see real life effects. For example, far-right candidates being voted as our presidents, or Russian asset presidents voted. So this is what they're looking for, real life damage.
Yeah, and dare I say, Viktor Orban, Yellow Vest protests, Catalonia, there is a whole list of real issues. But do you think they're active? I mean, they didn't create these issues, but are they pouring petrol on the flames? Is that what they're doing here?
That too, yes, definitely. And this is also why the troll factory is operating 24/7 and also in the nights, so that they can attack any ongoing political issues whenever they rise, and go infuriate people, go mobilize people, go find the most hot topics in which to fuel people into more hatred, into possible violence. And what I would like to point out as one of the most disgusting Russian operations from recent years are the operations which are directed into worsening the coronavirus pandemic outside Russia, and spreading, for example, the coronavirus vaccination, so that people, this is really destructive, and there should be really much more to be done as an attempt to counter this. And the Western governments should also start maybe thinking of ways of protecting their citizens more, because many people now who just feel that they are by accident in some anti-vaccination community online might be there because of Russian information warfare, and they have become and fallen victims of information warfare. And I see that our government should really do more to help these people.
And to an extent, the narrative there, isn't it, is that if you believe that, you start to distrust everything your government says, and they may not necessarily earn any kind of victory at that point, but later when something like the Ukraine war comes up, those same people might distrust what their government says about other issues. Is that a sort of more strategic way of thinking? That's why they're perhaps doing it.
That too, definitely. And one thing that I have noticed is that they want to erode trust into everything else besides themselves. So in addition to the credibility of the Western governments, they are also constantly attacking the Western traditional media and trying to portray the journalistic traditional media as some kind of propagandistic, unreliable fake news, when in fact they are the ones who are unreliable. Fake news commanded by security structures. And this is, I would say, one of the biggest lies that they have managed to feed to many Westerners. Many Westerners still view, for example, former Russia Today, RT, as just an alternative media which provides a Russian viewpoint to things. Well, it would definitely do so if it was organized by, let's say, Russian free citizens and citizen journalists, but it's in fact a tool of Russian information warfare, which has been even publicly stated by its own so-called editor-in-chief, Margarita Simonian. So this is also problematic that. But also, I have to sometimes give credit to these propaganda architects, because some of their operations are so simple that they just work because of that, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And even though he's not at the center of it, people like Surkov, there are some fairly clever, cynical people at the heart of those operations and who designed them and architected them.
Yes, definitely. But when you listen to these people, for example, Solovyev, Russian state media, one of the head propaganda architects, you think, are they on drugs? Seriously, they are so deep in the rabbit hole. And but unfortunately, they have been doing it for so many years, and they have been doing it repetitively, and then some of it sticks, and some of it becomes credible. And this is also one of the early teachings of why propaganda works when it's repeated enough. Just because I actually looked into some brain research about learning and why propaganda is actually working. And it is just because repetition creates this neural like new networks in brains, which are enhanced and enforced every time when a person hears certain statement. So it's like same thing as you would take your brain to the gym to work out, to repeat the same thing over and over again. So then at some point it becomes the reality lie when it's repeated enough times. And I will give you a personal example. Sometimes I was crying when I was reading those filth articles that have been created about myself, because I started to view myself in the light of those articles, in the repeated disgusting scenarios, just because I had seen them so many times. And that's why it's also, I can see why it is difficult for individual person to defend themselves against information warfare, because it is really warfare and it is impacting your brain. And yeah, I remember crying and seeing myself of those photos that they were portraying about me, looking really horrible, drug using, CIA, pro-NATO propagandist. I was crying and believing, and my self-esteem started to go down because I started seeing myself that way.
And you start to sort of even doubt your own motives at some kind of deep level. Is it also true as well that this propaganda works when it's combined with threat, when people's livelihoods are threatened, when their security is threatened? That threat may not be real, but clearly, Putin's regime and his propagandists have this endless cycle of external and internal threats which imprint this propaganda in people's minds.
Yes, definitely. And the power of fear and the feeling of fear and insecurity, like you put it, it's a big driving force. And what I have been thinking recently, when looking at the developments of the Kremlin's disgusting, outrageous, horrendous genocide against Ukraine, and at the same time seeing the Western reactions, and seeing that there has so far not been the type of intervention that the Ukrainians have asked for the most. So the Ukrainians are constantly asking for closing the skies and more military help, but so far we have not seen. So I have been thinking, is it possible that the Russians, especially Putin, who has threatened us multiple times during this accelerated warfare, if we intervene, he has said that there will be grave consequences, like never before seen or something like this, really horrible, and also insinuated the use of nuclear weapons. So and at least I have seen that original citizens are terrified over that scenario. So it would be strange if it did not also impact the decision makers. But I would really hope, and I would want to see that it did not impact, and that there would be enough strength and courage and unity in the West to intervene and to help those Ukrainian civilians in most grave need as possible.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember myself thinking in the first few days of the crisis whether he's crazy, whether he'd actually go that far. And then you listen to people like Garry Kasparov and Khodorkovsky, and you realize they say, no, this is just a bluff. This is the strategy of a bully who is trying to separate allies from each other and create sort of fear and division.
Exactly.
So when did you think all this troll activity really kicked in? Was it the Georgian War in 2008? Was it around Bolotnaya in 2012? Well, that's more of an internal issue to Russia, or the invasion of Crimea. When have you seen the sort of the peaks and development of these techniques?
Definitely, I personally started to witness it back in 2014 when Russia has attacked Ukraine first time and annexed Crimea, as well as inserted military personnel and weapons in eastern Ukraine, and doing all this in secrecy and denying all of this. So that was when I started seeing that the trolls were spreading conspiracy theories, for example, that European Union and NATO were in fact in charge of war in Ukraine, and that Russia is not involved in war in Ukraine, and that it's a civilian internal conflict in Ukraine, and so many other troll stories. Also denying Russia's involvement in the downing of MH17. So it was the Ukrainian attack against Ukraine and the warfare against Ukraine that really blew things up into my face as a journalist. And then, but already before that, interestingly, my friend Jukka Mallinen, who is a Finnish translator, and he has, for example, translated Anna Politkovskaya's, and he told me that he had witnessed, or his friend in Russia had told that as early as mid-2000, the FSB had been paying some small monies to FSB regional school students, so that those students would be writing comments to defame Russian opposition politicians. So this has been ongoing at least mid-2000. At least that is how far I have been able, with the help of my friends and experts, to track down how long some of this security service agitated trolling has been ongoing.
I mean, it was probably early then, but of course there was lots of stuff going on even back then with the Second Chechen War, the bombings of the flats in Moscow, which is widely believed to have been an FSB operation, and then even Beslan and the theater siege in Moscow. All these things, many rumors existed about them being partially set up by the security services to create internal terror and threat. So they must have had some kind of investment in hybrid warfare at the time to try and counter those narratives. But I guess the West wasn't really paying much attention at that point.
Unfortunately not. And Putin has been really eager to take full control of all of the media inside Russia already very soon after he started in power early 2000. He started to take control of the media. And I have only been thinking that he's so vain, I guess is the right word in English language, so kind of like detailed and so crazily obsessed about controlling everything and wanting to control all minds everywhere, that he then invented and started to generalize this use of social media propaganda and trolls. So it's part of his vanity and his obsessed fantasies of controlling everything and controlling everyone's minds, because these trolls they really micro-target individuals, whereas television, radio, and even newspapers, through those you are able to gather masses and masses attention. But with these trolls, some expert in Finland called them as snipers of information warfare, which I would say is really well put.
See, I mean, the only time I really noticed it was during the Skripal poisoning in Salisbury in the UK. And I went to Facebook. I have a lot of Russian friends there. I have friends who, let's say, have studied and lived in Russia. And at that time, almost everyone, I think, thought I was kind of crazy, because I immediately believed that this was SVR or a foreign operation, GRU kind of operation. It seemed completely obvious. The motives less so, but they fitted with the traditional pattern of terror, threat, more even for internal people and even the elite than the external audience. But even at that point, many Russians didn't want to believe that their government was capable of these things. And yet, clearly Putin and his clique come from the FSB, and this kind of hybrid or warfare, this psychological warfare, has been around for a very long time, hasn't it?
Yes, and many Finns actually told me that when I was doing my original investigation 2014-2015, that this troll shit is basically the old Soviet Union style propaganda, but in new digital channels. So it's easy to spot, easy to say that it's clumsy, just like in the Soviet times, and it's easy to say that it's fake, but it's just being put in new form of conveying information, the digital form. And so this is also interesting how some people still view that it's so modern or it's so sophisticated, because it certainly isn't. Just many people have been using trolls in, for example, I don't know, in IRC avatars, different pseudo personalities already years and years back. Okay, and now I see that there are swimmers coming in, but let's see if we can still continue.
Okay.
Maybe Russians.
see, see if they don't turn up in the camera.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the airliner, and I think what was interesting there is that Bellingcat has documented a lot of the disinformation efforts around that. One thing that emerges from that is a sort of classic strategy they adopt, isn't it? They put out a multitude of absurd stories, different versions of the so-called truth. And from one week to the next, those versions are different. It doesn't seem to matter. They throw them out like chaff to, misdirect a missile like a helicopter might. How does that kind of technique play out amongst social media? And does this sort of sniper effect of social media make this strategy even more effective?
Oh, yes, definitely. And it's perfect for social media. This type of technique is completely perfect, and they who design these operations, they don't even have to remember what they lied about last week, because they are already next to the going to the next conspiracy theory and making those live and inserting those seeds into the social media ecosystem. And some of them then grow and are planted really deeply and never go away. But yeah, for anyone who has ever done any kind of marketing or communications on social media, it's easy to see that this technique really works. And also on social media, it enables the targeting of different groups on a manner that has never been possible before. So, for example, we can market material Russian troll fantasies to, let's say, for example, people who live in a really small geographic area, who have certain types of religious beliefs, and who are, for example, administrators of certain Facebook groups. So we can have Russian troll material being shown only to those people, and then they can further spread it to their own networks. So definitely, and yeah, these, like I said, some of these theories sound like they have been invented while on drugs. So, but it's so, it doesn't matter, because on internet every kind of theories, that the crazier it is, the further it can spread, because such is internet's logic sometimes. But luckily there are fact checkers and people like Bellingcat's Elliot Higgins, who then can tell us that this is not true and this is Russian troll material.
Absolutely, and then one of the reasons for doing this podcast is really to try and uncover the techniques that people use when they look at this digital disinformation. What I'll be exploring, hopefully, in other episodes is what are the tools and the way of thinking that people can develop and adopt in order to look at information more critically. So that's sort of future sessions we've got planned on that. Now, you've actually been to the Internet Research Agency in St Petersburg, haven't you? So even though you're not allowed to travel there now, you've been there and you've spoken to some of the people who work there. How did you manage that? Is it secretive, or was it just hiding in plain sight, as it were?
It's definitely hiding in plain sight. For example, at that time, 2015 February, when we went there with my colleague Mika and a really excellent Russian stringer, Irina, everyone in Russia knew that it was the troll factory, because so many people had worked there and there was material about it all over Russian internet, and it had been completely in and out exposed already by really brave Russian journalists. For example, with Novaya Gazeta, Alexandra Karmasapova and others, who had already back in 2013 infiltrated the factory and reported everything they learned. So at that time it was certainly out in the public, but they still played hard to catch, and they were portraying themselves as Internet Research Agency, and they had recruitment ads also. It was super interesting. There were so many ads in which they were looking for new staff members. For example, they were not looking for Russian trolls attacking foreign elections. Instead, they were looking for social media managers, copywriters, as well as graphic designers to work in 12-hour shifts during night and daytime. And their job would include producing material online, also news. And then when we called the recruiter and we pretended that we want a job there, it was also very interesting, because then we asked, what kind of material do you want me to produce if I'm recruited there? And the recruiter lady said herself, political. So already back in 2015, there was an ongoing 24/7 political campaigns going on, because they were also in the job recruitment ads saying that they are looking for people who know English language. So it wasn't only Russian at that time. And also because they have the stupidest security guard in the universe in the whole universe. He taught us that this is some kind of state structure, because when we were filming outside the factory, so-called troll factory, the security guard came out and started yelling us, "Hey girls, can't you see this is regime izdani, an administrative building, that you need to leave or else I will call the police." So thank you, because he told himself that this is a special building. We didn't know. We really didn't have any source telling us that besides him.
It's exactly like Putin's palace being guarded by federal security agents. It's a bit of a giveaway, isn't it?
Yes.
So the background of the trolls. So I'm really fascinated with this because, you know, I've worked in digital media agencies for 20 years, which is one of the interests I've got in this. And would you say then the Troll Factory is sort of organized like a kind of agency? Does it operate in quite a traditional way, planning, producing assets, planning campaigns?
Definitely. Yes, and I would have to say that with your background, you would be perfect to run a Russian troll factory, because you would really know what to do and you would really know your way. So, for example, in the troll factory, I would also compare it to, let's say, a regular news agency. For example, the themes are given every morning, and the troll factory bosses are giving different themes that the troll workers need to write about. For example, today when they come to work, they have to write, let's say, just nasty stuff about opposition politicians. And then the next shift in 12 hours later would have to write about other things. And these themes, they can be easily redirected. And I can only guess where these themes come from. Actually, we already know, because in the US election interference investigation by Robert Mueller, Robert Mueller's investigators found out that Russian spies first infiltrated US society physically, and they gathered information about the hottest topics and themes in different swing states, and then provided that information to the troll factory, which then started bombarding those different target groups with material specifically designed to meet those thematic needs. For example, the supporters, the potential supporters of Donald Trump that were very religious Christians, they would be bombarded with memes and material portraying Hillary Clinton as some kind of Satan as well as criminal. So this is how the factories operate. The security services give them material.
And we saw the same in the UK with Cambridge Analytica, didn't we? Same kind of paid social media, the intense targeting based on interests and beliefs.
Exactly. It's exactly like that.
Russian propaganda can seem very crude and clumsy, but apparently it works on around 70% of the population, especially those that are consuming state TV. Now, although many sociologists would argue that you can't have genuine social research in the context of dictatorship, but why do you think these ridiculous labels that they're currently using in the Ukraine crisis, why do those work? You know, labels like fascist, banderovцы. How does this work on so many Russians, and what are the historical myths that feed, these narratives and beliefs?
Excellent question. This is also what I wanted to find out, and I looked into some brain research and neurology research, and I found out that unfortunately the human brain has this ability to really discriminate when portrayed with certain type of material. That is also one of the reasons why, for example, inciting into hatred against minorities is illegal in majority of, for example, the Western world, because it is always the first step of, for example, genocide. And in Russia's warfare and information warfare against Ukraine, it was evident already back in 2014, 2015, they were portraying heavily the Ukrainians as Nazis and fascists. And they have continued that ever since. We already saw those same words, heavy words being used by Putin himself, not just the trolls. So there is now already a big audience, first and foremost inside Russia, who seriously believe that Ukrainians are in fact Nazis and fascists, and at least their leaders are such. So, and therefore, those brother people in Ukraine need to be liberated from the hands of these Nazis and fascists. So this is part of demonizing this whole people of Ukraine as well as their leadership as an attempt to justify the war, especially to the people inside Russia. And so far it seems to be working brilliantly. And that's why I would also like to add that even though many people with whom I investigated the trolls back years ago, even though they could say that this troll material is clumsy and just like this old bullshit Soviet Union propaganda shit, I also am really worried of some audiences complete and utter reluctance to view how dangerous this material actually is. So there are people just who fall into this trap and who become victims, and therefore it's a little bit dangerous even for myself to try and say that part of this material is clumsy, the Soviet Union type of bullshit. So I would like to actually rephrase myself and say that yes, much of it is, but there is even more of such troll material that we don't even know about yet, because there is no one to investigate it yet. And also I would like to point out that there are so many operations ongoing against African countries, Asian countries. We just don't know about them.
To an extent, the more subtle sort of trolling probably doesn't even appear to be so.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in the phrase that you use in your book, and that is the political technologists that sit behind the creation of the troll farm. And that's a really fascinating phrase, because it's one that Putin's used before as well. He's described the color revolutions in Eastern Europe and Georgia as a kind of political technology. What do you think he means by that?
It's a tool. It's a form of impacting and influencing societies, kind of like outside the local politics, kind of like outside the native or natural politics. You could also use the term propaganda architects or architects of information warfare or active measures kings or something like this. So basically this security structure and their leaders who use just certain types of interference techniques in order to impact and influence in futures and developments of societies. It is a really interesting term, and I would have to say that when Putin himself has used it, when trying to describe alleging things about people who are organizing so-called color revolutions in the West, it's in fact Putin mirroring his own actions, because he is himself political technologist who is operating in so many different countries, trying to impact in their developments and in their futures with these nasty techniques that are being taught by officers in atmosphere of secrecy in some Moscow universities, as really well described by this author and this Russian author and publisher. My goodness, Yakovlev. Jesus, I forgot his name, but Yakovlev. But first name I just lost now. Please edit this somehow. But Yakovlev is his last name, and he described it super well. How he had been taught those special propaganda techniques in MGU, in Moscow State University, in actually the journalistic faculty. And they were basically being taught how to mess up people's brain, civilians' brain, with these techniques that were originally meant to be used by soldiers against enemy soldiers. But basically now, unfortunately, Russia is using these type of techniques to attack us and our brains. And his name was Vladimir Yakovlev.
I'll have to look that up. That sounds fascinating, and it must be in contrast to Western schools of journalism, where I guess they try to teach the techniques of reporting, how to try to be objective, etc. These journalistic schools in MGU they describe, they turn everything on its head, don't they? And they start with the point of view that you're trying to make somebody believe something that may or may not be true.
Yes, definitely, completely.
So let's imagine that Navalny and the liberals managed to depose Putin. They managed to replace his regime. What are they going to have to do to dismantle the troll factories and all this machinery of lies and deceit that has been created by Putin over 20 years?
Oh, wow. That is some scenario you have there. Unfortunately, I don't think that anything will change if Putin is replaced. As, for example, Roman Burko in my book, the Ukrainian volunteer who started the Inform Napalm community, which is, for example, conducting information warfare against the Kremlin, but also exposing their lies and their warfare against Ukraine. Roman told me really well that if Putin is replaced, it doesn't change anything, because there is already an army of new Putins waiting in line to be the new president of Russia. So basically that would not change anything, unfortunately, and I don't see that that would enhance or enable the dismantling of the troll factory, because the new Putin would just continue as the old one and would continue operating the troll farms and continue attacking the West, just like the new one. So, or just like the old Putin. So I'm sorry, I don't have anything to contribute there.
That's a horrible.
I would say your question is just so wishful thinking, kind of. It's kind of like so lovely, idealistic. I would love to answer it, but I just can't.
Well, it comes from listening to an interview with, I think it was Khodorkovsky, who'd been in Germany, and or maybe another commentator. I think it was Kasparov actually, and he remembers talking to some Germans of different generations. And he realized that the denazification, the re-education program of the Germans, it didn't work straight away. It took 25 years and almost an entire generation to grow up to, to go beyond the belief that actually, the Nazis weren't that bad. truth didn't sink in straight away. It took 20, 25 years to do that. It would seem from your statement there that Russia is going to face something similar, that even in the unlikely scenario that Putin is deposed and a liberal regime takes root, it could take decades to undo all the damage that's been done, all the indoctrination.
Yes, oh yes. And I don't know who will be able to do it.
Absolutely, because Germany was
just
occupied. One can't imagine Russia being occupied and someone coming in and imposing that re-education program on them.
This is a really interesting scenario again.
Interesting but improbable, it seems.
Yes.
Well, Jessika, it's been an absolutely tremendous pleasure speaking with you, and I'm really, really grateful that you've devoted so much of your precious time to speak to me this evening. And I also want to really thank you in your persistence in following the story of Putin's troll army, despite all of the threats and challenges that you've had along the way. And I'd really like to advise anyone listening to this to get Jessika's fantastic book. It's available on Kindle right now from the Amazon store, and I believe it's coming out in paperback later in the year, isn't it?
Correct. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for your insightful questions, and maybe we can continue someday.
Yes, that would be absolutely fantastic. Yeah, and we'll let you know about subsequent podcasts, and I'm sure I'll have a whole set of new questions to put to you in a couple of months' time as events change. But thank you so much.